Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm Finlo Costain, the editor of 8.9.com. In a recent podcast, we asked, should Scotland make room for the lynx? Today, we're moving on from the lynx to wolves and bears as well. What's it like living with large carnivores in the landscape, and should they be reintroduced in Britain? Jonny Hanson is an environmental social scientist from Queen's University Belfast, a Nuffield Scholar and author of Living with Lynx, Sharing Landscapes with Big Cats, Wolves and Bears, which investigates whether people in Britain could and whether they should learn to live with large carnivores again. Jonny, welcome. Your book is filled with excitement about the idea of sharing landscapes with large carnivores such as lynx, wolves and bears, but you're also someone who doesn't shy away from the challenges associated with that. Tell me what excites you about wilder landscapes.
Good morning, Finlo. It's great to be in the show. Thank you for having me. There is something really exciting about being in wild landscapes. I'm fortunate to live on the edge of the Glens of Antrim here in Northern Ireland, which are very similar to parts of Scotland. And my favorite parts of those landscapes are the bits where I can't see any houses. It's not that I don't like people. There's just something very exciting about being in landscapes like that. It doesn't mean that we don't need, and I don't like agricultural landscapes too, but there is a thrill that comes to me at least from those places. But I acknowledge that for some, they don't have the same feelings. We have this very complex relationship with the idea of wild. Some of us run towards it, but some of us run away from it. And these species that we're talking about today have come to symbolize the idea of wild as a place and as an idea, and through rewilding as a process.
You talked about the wild landscapes there and in Scotland, but of course, those landscapes don't currently include large carnivores. How would that change that landscape for you? Would that change the thrill? Does it make it dangerous? Does it? What emotional response do you think you'd have to walking through that same landscape with the idea that you might see a lynx or a wolf?
I suppose I'm drawing on my experience of walking through similar landscapes all across the world where species either similar or the same are present. And there is a bit of adrenaline that is going when you realize as a human being that you're not top of the food chain. There's a humility that must come with that, which I think is good for us as people. There's an excitement about wondering what might appear when you come round the corner. And I have a high tolerance for risk. I like that. I grew up, as we'll talk soon, in Africa, accustomed to being in landscapes where species like that are present. But again, I acknowledge and accept that not everyone has that same tolerance for risk. Not everyone wants to be in a landscape where those species are present, even though the risks to people are really very small, statistically speaking, because of that emotive element and that evolutionary past where we have these instinctive responses to these species. For many, those small levels of risk can become quite high levels of perceived risk. So it's an emotion. The emotional response for me is one of wonder and excitement and humility as well. But again, in this debate, not everyone thinks like that, and that's the source of much of the conflict and controversy.
I used to live in the west of Scotland, and there was a mountain that I used to go up quite regularly. The first time I went up with my son, he was 5, and it's almost a Munro. It's almost that height, and but it has
Mm.
two summits, and by the time you've done both summits, it's definitely that height. And we would go prepared, and sometimes we'd meet snow on the top, and we'd have the right equipment, and we take it seriously, and we take our time going up and down. But the Cobbler was also somewhere where lots of people from inner city Glasgow would go, often on a whim, not necessarily with any sense of preparation. And so, if you went at certain times of the year, you might pass people trying to go up in high heels or sandals or, just with completely the wrong kind of equipment. Now, for me, going into that landscape, where there are large carnivores, I would be going in with a sense of preparation,
Mm.
exactly as you say with that. How do you think the general public would respond to a sudden realization that there's a different level of risk within that landscape that they're going into already not prepared for?
Well, I think it's important to recognize when we talk about large carnivores and when we talk about potential reintroduction of species to Britain, we're talking about species that pose very different levels of risk to people. There is virtually no risk to human beings from a lynx, which is a medium-sized cat about the size of a Labrador. There is a bit more risk to human beings from wolves, which are the size of a husky or a large German Shepherd and often hunt in packs, there is more risk again then from an adult brown bear, which can be 3, 4, 500 kilos. And how you respond to those different species is very different. How you prepare. I would need very little preparation, none, to walk through a landscape with lynx. I wouldn't be worried about my kids. With wolves, I probably wouldn't be worried if I had a dog or something with me. I would be more concerned about the dog running off into the bush. With brown bears, I would be wanting to carry bear spray if I was in a landscape with brown bears. Not so much black bears, but brown bears for sure. So it's important to distinguish, and we're obviously going to be talking about lynx primarily, wolves secondly. Not sure that anyone has any real plans for bears back in these islands, but you never know. You never know.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And we'll come back to this later on, but
Mm.
it's the idea of the risk, the real risk, and the perceived risk. And of course, most people's experience of walks comes from Little Red Riding Hood or something like that. So
These
that perception of risk is quite different to the reality. But I said that you were a realist in terms of rewilding in this way, and so I wonder if you could just talk about one or two of the challenges for people currently living with large carnivores in their landscapes.
I think a good place to consider for that, given that it's close to us in Britain and Ireland geographically, but also it's very similar culturally and politically and agriculturally, is Western Europe, where large carnivores, both lynx and wolves and bears, have returned in astonishing numbers to large parts of Western Europe, especially over the last couple of decades. And that is an astonishing ecological recovery. But at the same time, it has posed significant challenges for some rural communities who live alongside them, especially for livestock farming communities who have to change often how they farm, in that they have to relearn how to farm in a way that deters large predators from attacking livestock. Sometimes lynx, especially wolves, also bears with sheep. And that involves changes to routines. It involves pressures on profit margin. And it can also be seen symbolically because these species, they're biological beings, but they're also psychological symbols. Those changes can be seen as a form of almost symbolic risk. And what I mean by that is an assault on a way of life, which again is different from the very low levels of risk. The chance of a lynx taking sheep is very small, statistically speaking, but the perception that that's going to change the way you farm and maybe even the way you live is a real one. That is a reality for many farming communities. I don't think enough attention has been paid to that in the conservation community, which is where my interest comes in saying that we try to avoid some of those things in debates in these islands. I think also for rural communities, a lot of these conflicts, which are really about conflicts between people over predators rather than conflict between people and predators, they could be solved at a local level by people sitting down and having a conversation over a cup of tea and developing trust. But in all of these scenarios, both recently what happened in Scotland and across Western Europe, especially when there is a threat to human life or a loss of life of an animal, when that happens, um, it becomes a media circus tends to ensue. There is mis and disinformation on social media across the spectrum of opinions, from the romanticizing through to the demonizing. It becomes suddenly an issue of national attention. It brings a lot of heat, a lot of politicking, a lot of social media and media scrutiny. And I think that makes it hard to solve these at a local level when they could be. So that whenever that happens, as we saw in Scotland, as we saw whenever Ursula von der Leyen's pony was killed by a bear, or the Italian jogger in North Italy, both at the end of 2022. I think it adds so much heat and intensity to the debate that it can detract from actually solving it in a pragmatic way at a local level.
Yeah, and of course, that was actually the reason why we did our recent program on the lynx in Scotland, because there was an article that had appeared in the Times that had been written by one of the guests on the podcast, but the headline that had been associated with it was unnecessarily, needlessly provocative, and of course, put a lot of people's backs up even before they started reading the article. So what we wanted to do was to kind of take some of the heat out so that there could be a sensible conversation about this, exactly as you say. Now, we're talking about livestock farmers, and of course, lots of farmers are going to be listening to this program. So I think it's worth explaining that although you are fascinated with large carnivores, you've also been a farmer, and a lot of your research was carried out as part of a Nuffield farming scholarship. So tell us about where you farmed.
Well, I'm very proud to come from a long line of farmers in Northern Ireland on both sides of my family, but especially on my mother's side. My grandfather, who just passed away recently before the book came out, taught me to farm from a very early age. And I also grew up in my primary school years in a rural and farming community. Most of my friends were farmers, or their parents were. They farmed full-time or part-time. But I'm aware that some of my memories of farming from those times of my life were colored by the halcyon days of youth, lower. And when I then came to set up and run my own small farm, which was Northern Ireland's first community-owned farm, which was the only way that I could access land, because I had this lifelong interest in farming alongside this lifelong interest in large carnivore conservation. It was a very different ball game actually running it myself. And I suppose up to that point, either my experience of farming had been assisting my grandfather and my uncle, or my friends growing up, or had come from more an academic, theoretical background. And actually managing a piece of land and trying to balance the environmental, the economic, and the social, trying to cope with the cascading demands of market, state, and society simultaneously. It made me, I wouldn't say all of my theories went out the window, but I became a lot more pragmatic in terms of it, realizing that there are always trade-offs between those aspects of sustainability. And it can be very challenging running a small farm to to balance all of that. And so now when I come to this issue of large carnivore reintroductions, I look at it through my academic training and my PhD in snow leopard conservation in Nepal, where I worked and talked to hundreds of farmers there. And now my research through Nuffield, when I talk to 50 plus farmers and rewilders across Western Europe and North America, I look at it through that lens of interrogating ideas. But I also look at the same issue through my experience of running, albeit a community owned rather than family farm, of implementing ideas. And I think, how would these ideas work for me standing in a field in terms of my daily routine, my bottom line, and my way of life? And through the book and the research, I tried to look at it simultaneously through those quite unique lenses. And the book is the result of that.
When I was reading the book, there was a lot of conversation there about the challenges that were posed and perhaps overcoming the challenges. I wasn't quite sure coming away the degree to which any of the farmers that you met were enthusiastic for the idea of large carnivores in the landscape. Were they enthusiastic, some of them, or were they all just kind of modeling on and coping with it, particularly those farmers in areas where large carnivores have been reintroduced, I suppose?
I think, as with any segment of society or any occupation, when we say farmer, it's quite a broad church. It's a broad church in this country. It's a broad church everywhere. And within the farming communities that I visited, or even before the Nuffield Scholarship work in Nepal, there are broad spectrum of opinions in terms of how people relate to large carnivores. I would say, and this draws partly on my work in Nepal, that in terms of how people related to snow leopards and felt about snow leopards, there were two interesting things that I found. One was that losing livestock to snow leopards made people more negative. And where I encountered farming families who had lost livestock to large carnivores, that obviously and understandably influenced their point of view. But even more than the loss of livestock to large carnivores, in Nepal, the single biggest factor about how people felt about snow leopards was how they felt about snow leopard conservation and about snow leopard conservationists. And that's a reminder that in terms of thinking about reintroducing large carnivores, it's not just ecology happening, it's something that people do. And so how farmers relate to lynx is through the medium of how farmers relate to lynx conservationists and the policies and practices used to bring about that goal. So that's a really important reminder that, again, we're not so much talking about this conflict between people and predators. We're talking about conflict and cooperation between people over predators.
That's really interesting that the human behavior element is absolutely crucial. Very often, when I'm talking about the climate and nature crisis and the way that that's going to affect society, in terms of collapse and sort of large change, it's always about the impact that that has on human beings and how they respond. And it's the way that humans respond that mean that we will succeed or fail in terms of dealing with that crisis. So that's
Absolutely.
fascinating in terms of this. Now, you were born in Malawi, lived your early years in Derry in Ireland, and then returned to Malawi when you were 11. What was that transition like for you, going from Ireland to Malawi?
I I say I grew up between Ireland and Malawi as opposed to growing up between Ireland and Malawi because it wasn't that I lived in one for a long period of time and then never came back and then lived in another. We moved back and forward a lot. We were home every summer, hence why I spent my teenage years working on summer jobs with my grandfather and uncles, and mostly with cattle and sheep. And that moving between them, I suppose I forged an identity, especially by my late teenage years, as somewhere in between. I became comfortable being in between being Irish and Malawi, in between being European and African. And even my time in Ireland, I grew up between Ireland North and South. So I became accustomed to growing up in either a society that was still in conflict or then was post-conflict. And that translates now into this topic in that I'm comfortable being in between and I'm
Mm.
comfortable holding the tension that I absolutely love large carnivores, but I love livestock too. If someone gave me £1 million, Finla, today I'd go out tomorrow and buy a farm, and the next day I'd start my herd of cattle. And if anyone's listening to this podcast and wants to buy my book, you're indirectly contributing to Johnny's fund his farm fund. Uh, but I also love large carnivores as I've spent a large part of my life working on their conservation. And I think that upbringing where I was in between different worlds now means that I'm comfortable in between these different worlds here. And that's important because we need people who are somewhere in between who can arbitrate and bring extremes together.
What did your parents do that they were able to move back and forth?
Well, for especially for your Scottish listeners, there is a very strong link between Malawi and Scotland, and to a lesser extent Ireland through the Presbyterian Church, going back to David Livingstone. So it
Mm.
was through that, I guess you could call, international network that brought us to different parts of Ireland and then brought us to Africa and to Malawi.
I'm interested in the way that you linked the idea of conflict in Ireland to and growing up with an understanding, growing up immersed, just by virtue of the fact that you exist in a conflict area,
Mm.
that must give you a particular understanding of conflict that people in England probably would rarely encounter, if at all. And then being able to bring that into this conversation, being able to sort of, I guess, try to see both sides in order that you're able to sort of find the middle way. Is that right?
100%, 100%. So no, I grew up before the time that I lived in Malawi, moving back and forth between the Republic of Ireland and the north of Ireland, and sometimes kind of caught between being seen as a southerner in the north and being seen as a northerner in the south. So I became very aware of sectarianism. And I'm very wary of the Protestant Catholic sectarianism as I am of the Sunni Shia and the rewilder farmer reintroduce, not reintroduce sectarianism, which it can devolve into. And it's one of my concerns about reintroductions that that may happen. But also, more importantly and pragmatically, in terms of seeing the unworking of the Northern Irish peace process and some of the learning that we can take from that about the importance of shared institutions that bring people together, the importance of compromise in building a shared future where nobody gets everything that they want, but everyone hopefully gets a good bit of what they want. Those ideas now I bring into my work currently at Queen's, which has a degree of environmental peace building, but also I would say to the environmental movement. In these islands, the greatest concentration of peace building expertise and practice in the UK or Ireland, possibly in Europe and maybe even the world, is in Northern Ireland. So we should be in the environmental movement and the agricultural sector where there are a lot of conflicts over the future of land, as there are an increasing number of demands on what we do with the land, climate, nature, food security, all of these things, that we should be taking many of those principles and that experience from peace building in Northern Ireland and helping us to use it to solve environmental conflicts.
Yeah, that idea of peace building within the environmental movement is something very much on my mind at the moment. We recorded a podcast earlier this week, and people, when this goes out, it'll be 2 or 3 weeks back. But after an article that came out from a journalist called George Monbiot, which was attacking a couple of reports from FAI Farms and the Sustainable Food Trust that was looking at livestock and how livestock can live in the land and how they can contribute ecologically. And there is a real need, I think, in Britain at the moment and in other places in the Western world, particularly, to understand the role of ruminants. And there is so much baggage that exists within the environmental sector where it is a real us and them. It feels like
Yeah,
sectarianism,
it
where
does.
you have people who are angrily and vociferously anti-livestock,
Yeah.
and others who, like me, see livestock as being absolutely essential parts of an ecological future. So perhaps we should have a conversation outside this podcast as well, Johnny.
Absolutely. Happy to come back on. There's lots to talk about.
I wonder how easy it was for you to adapt to the presence of large carnivores when you went into it, when you were when you said that you were growing up, sort of going back and forth. So maybe it wasn't you didn't feel that adaptation in quite the same way, but clearly, walking around in Northern Ireland would have been different to walking around in Malawi.
Very much so. Very much so. And there's a couple of interesting points there from my time living in Malawi, at least living there from 11 to 18 when I remembered these things. I don't really remember my time there as an infant. Um, One of them was just, again, it depended on the large carnivore. So on the edge of the city of Blantyre, named after Blantyre in Scotland, one of the fastest growing cities in the world at the time, where mountain forest reserves with breeding populations of leopard and hyena, but also bush pig baboons. We ran half wild through those landscapes with school every week, and we saw sign of those large carnivores, but we never really saw them. But again, it was about being prepared and just knowing. It would be different going there to the hyena clan's cave at nighttime as opposed to being there in a group during the day. Um, and similarly, while we never rarely saw or felt threatened by those particular species, if there had been lion or buffalo or rhino or elephant in that landscape, we wouldn't have been let run wild in those landscapes. Our behavior would have been different. So again, there's a difference there between the species in question and how we react to them, but also in terms of there's an issue here about where these animals belong because we think of these species belonging in the national parks, the Yellowstones and the Serengetis, but here on the edge of one of the world's fastest growing cities at the time, sometimes in the fastest growing city were leopard and hyena. So there's this conceptual thing for us about where is wild enough for these species? Is it over there where people are not? But it is also can it also be on these spaces where people are too? And that's going to be a live issue in this island and these islands in the coming decades. But the third element, I suppose, what I began to learn as I spent time in Malawi and in these landscapes was that I was conscious, or I became conscious, that my relationship with these animals was based on living in a relative affluence in an urban area, going and being in their landscape and returning to my family home and not feeling threatened or having my livelihood threatened in that same country. And sometimes in those landscapes, people were losing maize crops to elephants, losing goats to leopards, or maybe even losing their lives to crocodiles when they were washing clothes in the river. And the large carnivores are the same. They've been the same for millions of years doing what they do. But my perception of those species was different from those who lived closest to them. And that is something that has always stuck with me, and strikes me now in Scotland, in Ireland, in Wales, and England that we should pay special attention to those whose livelihoods are likely to be most affected by their potential return and make sure that their concerns are addressed.
What did you live in Malawi in terms of the degree to which you were in an urban setting or a rural setting? I kind of, when I sort of reading and I kind of have a vision of where you are, but it's probably completely inaccurate.
Mostly urban. A school was urban. It was an international school in a city. It was a mostly urban environment. But even cities in Malawi would have been there would have been more informal parts to them than there would be in a city, maybe in the UK or Ireland. But certainly as often as we could, as a family or with school, we spent time out in the bush and in the mountains. And I should also add, I hope to be back in Malawi next summer with two of my oldest kids for the first time. And I'm thinking about it visiting a national park where I would have gone as a teenager, where there are a lot of leopard, and I'm not worried about leopard being there with my kids. But occasionally there are itinerant lions in that national park that wander over the border from Zambia. And I think being there as a parent, even with two young teenagers, I think my perspective may be slightly different than when I was a young teenager
Yeah.
and had no dependents to worry about.
It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah, I I mentioned earlier on the idea of going up mountains with my kids, and
Yeah.
I can hop up a mountain quite happily by myself, but suddenly you go up with a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old, and you think, oh my goodness, you're just aware of every possible
Yeah.
risk and precipice that you wouldn't have noticed
No.
otherwise. Absolutely. Now, you travelled to several countries with your Nuffield Scholarship, investigating how farmers and their livestock manage to live alongside wolves, lynx, and bears. Now, clearly, you weren't going into that investigation raw. You had some ideas. You'd already, met some farmers previously.
Hmm.
But were there things that you learned that surprised you?
Yeah, two things stand out. Finlo, one is that although the book is called Living with Lynx, and primarily I set out to discuss living with lynx because it's the most likely candidate species for reintroduction to Britain. Less so Ireland because we're not sure if we ever had lynx on the island for various reasons. Um, and what I discovered is that wherever wolves have returned, wolves just hijack the conversation. So much of the book, although I set out to talk about lynx, was actually about living with lynx and living with wolves and living with bears. And there's a lesson here that the bigger the body size of the large carnivore, the more challenges that often come with it. So, for example, in Switzerland, whenever lynx were reintroduced in the 70s, there were very few problems. The roe deer population started to decline in the 90s, and we saw a spike in the killing of sheep by lynx, so a compensation scheme was introduced. But no one in Switzerland now that I talk to is really worried about lynx. People, it's wolves that have taken over the conversation. The other thing that struck me,
So is there a degree to which it's like if you stub your toe, then the best way to forget that pain is to whack your elbow. It's something
it is a
slightly
bit like
larger
that.
comes along.
Well, you're joking, but I was talking to the lead wolf ecologist in the Netherlands, and he said, you know that how we fix problems with wolves in the Netherlands? Reintroduce bears. If we reintroduce bears to the Netherlands, no one will have a problem with wolves. So if we reintroduce lynx to Scotland, then the way to deal with that would be to
Reintroduce
reintroduce wolves, and
dragons as
suddenly
well.
there'd be no
Yeah.
problems with lynx anymore.
Yeah.
But
Sorry, I interrupted you. You were
no, that's okay. The other thing that struck me that I wasn't prepared for, maybe because I'd worked with snow leopards where you're working in landscapes where snow leopards have always been, is that when species return to a landscape, not so much solitary cats, but particularly wolves, because I saw this in Nepal in later research after my PhD, when wolves return, people find it really hard to share landscapes with wolves. Cats are solitary, you hardly ever see them. Sometimes the snow leopards, they can get into a corral and kill multiple animals at once. That causes a problem. I'm not aware of that ever happening with lynx. But wolves generate a lot of heat. They do in Nepal, the places that I worked, but I was really taken aback by the degree of intensity about wolf return in the Netherlands and in Switzerland. Because to me, those countries are effective, efficient states that are models of consensus building, the federal model in Switzerland, but also that consensual approach to building coalitions that the Dutch have and managing water as they have for centuries. And I was quite taken aback by the ferocity of the conflict, and it it made me quite sad to see that. So I'd really hope that we could avoid those sort of conflicts in Britain or Ireland. That the optimistic part of me hopes that we can. The pragmatic part to me thinks that we won't.
One of the things that you talked about quite a lot in the book is compensation and compensation schemes. And this might seem like an odd segue for people listening, but it'll make sense in a moment. One of the anecdotes that struck me about Malawi was that quite unusually you didn't get malaria. Tell us why, and then tell us what that taught you.
Hmm. Well, we had a very effective multi-layered defense system in our family home in Blantyre for dealing with malaria, including mosquito screens, mosquito nets. We took medication for many years. We doused ourselves in mosquito repellent. We covered up our ankles and legs, lower legs every evening. Um, but there was one rainy season that was particularly bad, and malaria surged in the rainy season because there's lots of standing water, so mosquitoes are breeding, and then there's an increased incidence of the malaria parasite being passed on. And one particular rainy season that was especially bad, my parents posted a bounty, run out of options, still loads of mosquitoes around. They said, we'll pay you 50p, me and my sister, 50p for every mosquito that you kill. And something just clicked in my head.
That's
Finlo,
quite a large bounty,
it was a
50p.
large bounty, given that I was earning maybe £3 a week in pocket money at those days. It was a solid sum, and six mosquitoes was my week's take of pocket money. And I just went to work with a vengeance and started slaughtering mosquitoes who would turn up on the mosquito screens every morning. But also, I discovered later we'd filled the bath in my parents' ensuite bathroom to have water because there would sometimes be water shortages, just to pumping issues with and power cuts. And I noticed one day that mosquitoes were actually breeding in the bathtub. And because the financial incentives for me were that I actually want mosquitoes around now to be a source of income, I remember I didn't tell my parents. I thought this is a license to breed money. So I kept my mouth shut.
Your
And the
first farming
lesson,
experience.
what's that?
Your first farming experience.
It was farming mosquitoes, that's right. But the lesson then for compensation schemes is small amounts of money can change human behavior a lot, a
Tell us some of
lot.
the ways that you have observed that.
Well, there's a tension. So compensation schemes are you lose livestock, you get compensated, or you insure livestock, you get compensated. Sometimes you can also have environmental performance type payments where you get paid as a landowner for having these livestock on your land, or maybe if they reproduce on your land, you get a bonus, that sort of thing. But they all work by transferring the cost from those who want to have these animals back, usually we the public, because we could theorize that these animals are a public good, and they transfer the cost from those who want them to those rural landowning and livestock owning communities who are bearing the costs, particularly losses of livestock. But in practice, there is a tension then between the speed and ease with which you compensate farmers and the need to balance the safeguarding of public money. So sometimes these schemes will involve DNA testing to make sure, for instance, that it was in the Netherlands that it was a wolf that killed a sheep as opposed to a domestic dog, which is a major threat to sheep in Britain and in Ireland, for instance. So there's a tension there in terms of the speed with which these things are and the efficiency with which they're managed, and also making sure that the funding to finance them is there over long periods of time as well. That's another crucial consideration.
Now, I'm not going to go into too much more detail about compensation schemes, although you talk about them, quite a lot with, some detail in the book, because we talked about them quite a lot, as I say, recently. And if people are interested in hearing more about possible compensation schemes and the difference between them and what's being considered in terms of the UK, should the lynx, for example, be reintroduced, then our podcast, Should Scotland Make Room for the Lynx, is precisely for you. So just scroll back in your podcast feed and you'll find that. But Jonny, when we're talking about large carnivore reintroductions, as we discussed in Britain, we're generally talking about wolves and the lynx. And, I think there are a lot of assumptions that people, make about these animals. We kind of know more or less the size. You've already mentioned the size, but we don't know that much more about them. And I just wonder if you could tell us a bit about these animals and perhaps also why and when they went extinct.
Sure. So the Eurasian lynx size of a Labrador is a medium-sized cat. Not technically not a big cat, although a very large Eurasian male lynx would be similar size to a very small female snow leopard. But they tend to be forest specialists. They tend to specialize in hunting roe deer. And across Europe, they have recovered in large part. Sometimes that has been supplemented by reintroductions as opposed to the natural return, what we call a recolonization. And we last had lynx in Britain definitively about 1300 years ago. So think Saxons just before the Vikings turned up. There is some emerging evidence that is literary rather than scientific that there's potentially lynx in Scotland all the way up to the 1700s, which would bring forward the presence of the species by 1,000 years. But either way, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of years since their absence, which means there's no longer a memory in our culture of living with these species or practice in our farming communities of farming with these species. And that is the case then also for wolves, which are pack hunters as opposed to the solitary lynx. They're capable of taking much bigger animals, so red deer, but they can also, for example, in Yellowstone, they've learned to hunt bison or buffalo. And in parts of Europe, for example, in Switzerland, whenever wild deer and sheep numbers are low, they have learned to start taking cattle. So, and they can kill horses too, as we saw with Ursula von der Leyen's pony in late 2022. Again, those are rare, but there is more risk to livestock with wolves because of they're bigger, more powerful animals. They hunt in packs. And we had wolves around despite those challenges and risks and the fact that they're bigger animals that need more food and wander over a much bigger area than lynx. They are incredibly intelligent and adaptable, and they're able to adapt to live in landscapes where people are, probably even more so than lynx. And that meant that we had wolves across these islands for much longer. I think in Scotland up into the late into the 1600s, but in Ireland all the way up to the late 1700s, and that's the last record, probably into the early 1800s. So a lot more recent in time, but again, not in living memory. So we've lost the cultural memory and we've lost the memory or the practice of farming and living with animals like these. We get most of our impressions from Disney stories and fairy tales.
Exactly.
Sure.
You mentioned the favoured habitat of the lynx being woodland. Is there a favoured habitat for wolves, or are they really quite versatile?
They are quite versatile, and even lynx, you will find lynx across snow leopard habitats, 2 million square kilometers, which is very little forested areas. And in those parts, they would be present in non-forested areas and well as well. But certainly in Europe, they are forest specialists. Lynx or wolves are more adaptable. But again, their preference will be to avoid people as much as possible. But and that poses a challenge. It can pose a challenge then in terms of that adaptability of wolves because they will show up in landscapes where people are living and farming. And certainly, I visited a family in the Netherlands farming in as domestic and agrarian a landscape, much like the one on the screen behind you, that you can think of. And there's something. This is where I come back to the conceptual aspect of where is wild enough to have these species. Is it the Yellowstones and the Serengetis, or is it also landscapes like the one behind your screen or that one in the Netherlands? Because wolves certainly are able to adapt to live in landscapes like that. And lynx, if there are pockets of forest big enough for roe deer, then lynx will expand to fill that territory, as some of the ecological modelling for Scotland and the north of England has shown.
And for those who are listening to this as an audio podcast, my screen is of it's more or less this time of year. It's an agricultural field. It doesn't actually have livestock in it, but there are a few oak trees that are coming out into leaf and one or two buttercups. So it's a very English Dorset rural kind of landscape that Jonny's seeing there. I wonder, Jonny, because we talked about the way that you're an enthusiast for large carnivores, but also a realist, also a farmer, and you've had lots of conversations with farmer. Could you argue against yourself? Could you tell me what the best arguments and perhaps the worst arguments are, or the best arguments for reintroducing them, and the case against?
Yeah, for sure. And I've tried to do a decent job of setting out all of these in the book as much as
You do,
possible.
and you do a brilliant job. I mean, I highly recommend reading the book. Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure there'll be something in it that pleases everybody and probably something that displeases everybody. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's good to be challenged. And I include myself in that. So I'm glad you're asking me that question. I still think that the ecological case is the strongest. It is not a panacea. Lynx and wolves alone will not solve the nature crisis by themselves, let alone the climate crisis. I think it's a bit disingenuous and misleading to claim that because the evidence is not there to back that up, in my opinion, as we'll maybe talk about shortly. But nevertheless, there is still a strong ecological case that these animals are able to unleash powerful effects in our ecosystems through something called trophic cascades, through changing the number of deer, but also through something called the landscape of fear when they change the behavior of deer that we as humans cannot replicate through hunting, and that is good for all the different levels of the web of life underneath these apex predators, who are called apex predators because they're at the top of the food chain. And there are benefits, for example, to farmers who have problems with deer, that potentially from controlling and changing the number and behavior of deer. So it would absolutely be good for nature and for wildlife. There's a study from Finland with lynx, for instance, that looked at ground nesting birds And often when you have apex predators back in a landscape, you suppress what are called the mesopredators. So the red foxes in that would be in Britain and Ireland, coyotes in North America, jackals in Africa. And it's often for farmers, and particularly for sheep farmers, those mesopredators actually cause more damage than the apex predators. So there may even be a benefit in that regard too. Again, we wouldn't know until it happened, but we can theorize about it. So the ecological case is strong. It's not absolute, it's not a panacea or a silver bullet, but it is strong.
So,
But
so are these animals actually taking foxes, killing foxes to eat, or are they just changing where the fox is?
bearing in mind I'm not an ecologist, my
Mm,
understanding is that it's a bit of both.
yeah.
They're changing. For example, I would know big cats a lot better. The presence of tigers in a landscape will change where leopards,
Mm.
they will change even the time of day that a leopard is active. So they're changing, I would imagine, the behavior of foxes. But I saw a picture on social media recently of a Eurasian lynx with a fox, a dead fox that it had killed. So indirectly, a bit like with deer, the number and behavior, then they would be changing probably through both methods, the population of foxes.
I guess it's a bit like that sort of playground hierarchy, isn't it? Where, you know who the bigger kids are, and if you need to stay away from them, and that sort of affects your behavior in the playground in terms of where you go, where you feel comfortable at different times.
Very much so.
And if the bigger kids, the bullies move, then you move as well.
You move with
Yeah,
them. Yeah,
yeah.
that's a good analogy. And you're segueing very nicely into my discussion of the weakest part of the case, which for me is not the nature part, but the human nature part, not the animals, but the political animals. And I think the political aspects of all of this are very, very weak. And I think we saw that recently in Scotland with the First Minister just putting a red pen through even the well-intentioned legal attempts to reintroduce lynx a few weeks after the illegal release of those Eurasian lynx into the Scottish Highlands. And I think there is significant political risk to these projects, partly because of politicians coming into power and the risk of these animals becoming political footballs, which is what we're seeing in Europe at the moment with the wolf, where support for the wolf is kind of getting mapped onto left, right, urban, rural, liberal, conservative, those sort of fault lines, and that would worry me about that happening in the UK or Ireland, but also trickling down from the politicians at the top, because of ultimately these decisions will probably be made by politicians and political parties, and those can change every 5 years along with priorities. But underneath that, policy priorities can change too. And I think that there's a lot of risk from the funding for the coexistence toolkit, this package of management, governance, and financial tools that we can use to share landscapes between livestock farming and large carnivore conservation, that the funding for that being paid through agri-environmental schemes, which are very subject to change. And as we saw in England recently, just rugs get pulled out from under environmental farming schemes and other things like that abruptly. And that doesn't inspire confidence in landowners that the funding will be there to pay compensation costs on the timescale that is involved in landowning, not 5 years of a pilot project or 5 years of a politician's tenure,
Yeah,
but
for
the
decades.
multi-decades and generations which farmers are on the land. We need to make sure that the funds to promote coexistence are there in that same time frame. And that is why one of the things that I would like to see is what I call coexistence trust funds, where there are multi-million pound endowments in reintroduction landscapes that are managed by a range of stakeholders to make sure that the funds to pay for compensation and coexistence costs are there on the same timescale of owning land. That's going to be essential in my view.
Interesting. Now, when people think of large carnivores in the landscape, and we talked before about, assumptions and fables, Little Red Riding Hood, things that, people kind of assume might be the case with large carnivores in the landscape. I think many environmentalists, many people who would love to see this, they're thinking of these creatures in the distance on windswept moors or disappearing among the trees in the shadowy forest. But actually, to cope with the challenges, the landscape would have to become much less free, wouldn't it? There'd be a lot more fencing, I think, for example, restricting public access, particularly, where places with the right to roam, or in the Scottish Highlands, where at the moment people can walk reasonably freely under freedom to roam legislation. So there's this idea that, these large landscapes might have this sort of romantic reintroduced large carnivore, but actually there might be quite a lot of restriction.
There might be, and we may end up, and one of the ways through this, between at one end, the romantic vision of lynx and wolves running free across many parts of the British landscape, through to at the other extreme, never having any of these species back whatsoever. The real challenge is not so much having these species back, but where in the landscape they are. Are they on the land of people who are quite happy to have them there? Large landowners, charities, maybe state land, versus livestock farmers who don't want them. And if we can find ways to separate landscapes through hard fencing, wire fencing, or even potentially in the future, some sort of digital fencing, then I think that could be one of these pragmatic ways that finds a compromise. But it will be a compromise because it's not the romantic ideal of a rewilded landscape that some are maybe advocating for, but it may be a pragmatic tool to allow these animals back in the landscape. There's also a lesson there from South Africa. So when we lived in Malawi, we went to South Africa quite a lot for holidays. We spent a lot of time around Kruger National Park in South Africa. And in the area around the region around Kruger Park is one of the world's most extraordinary wildlife comebacks, because farmers realized that they could make more money from farming wildlife for tourism, for food, and for hunting than they could for farming livestock. That the landscape and the ecosystems could actually support much greater densities of wild herbivores and wild carnivores than just cattle or sheep. And around that, the greater Kruger National Park area has grown up loads and loads of private game reserves and nature reserves that operate, though, on a very different model. That is private conservation, and profit is the motive. And I think there are lessons. I'm not saying that we could copy and paste the South African model to Britain and Ireland, but I
I was going
think
to
there
say,
are
I'm kind of
lessons.
imagining the way that an environmentalist view might change if we're sort of, changing from the idea that wolves in the Scottish Highlands to then promoting the idea that other people might come in and try and shoot those wolves.
And you would be surprised where support comes from for that, because in Feral, George Monbiot talks about having regulated hunting of wolves in Britain as a means to give agency to rural communities when there's a problem with a wolf and livestock, to create a base of support among the hunting community, but also to keep wolves afraid of people and keeping their distance. So you'd be surprised that where support for things like that can come. But the point is whether or not we copied and pasted the South African model and took it to Britain. And it might only work in places like Scotland where there are very large land holdings. The lesson for me is that we can't just talk about romantic notions of rewilding. Well, it also has to pay its way. And we need to make farmers an offer they can't refuse and back that up with long-term funding so that they see the financial benefits from having these animals on their land, and including, for example, through surcharges on tourism that may result. So
So it's
it
turning large carnivores from a threat to an opportunity.
absolutely turning them from a liability into an asset, saying the opportunity for profit, and profit sometimes in the environmental world is a dirty word, but we need to find that balance between the economic, the environmental, and the social.
We talked a bit about trophic cascades and landscapes of fear, and I wanted to pick your brains about your findings around wolves and Yellowstone National Park. Now, many will have heard the idea that the idea that wolves have been credited with changing the shape of the river, of the water in the landscape there. You found it wasn't quite that simple, that there was a kernel of truth to that, but it was more complicated.
It is more complicated, and I went, not being an ecologist by training, having encountered it through all of my work across the world and running a farm, which all farmers by definition have to be ecologists. Nevertheless, I went to Yellowstone as a fully paid up believer in the wolves change rivers thesis, that wolves alone were responsible for this ecological renewal. But I was there with one of North America's leading wolf ecologists who's involved in the return of the species to Colorado, who just helped me see, and subsequently reading the scientific literature, that it is, as you say, a little bit more complex. At the same time as wolves were reintroduced, beavers were also reintroduced to the neighboring state forest and were dispersing into the park as wolves were dispersing in the park. And also, as Joanna pointed out, ecosystems are not monolithic. There are always multiple factors at work, just as there are multiple factors at work in society. And that's what I seek to understand as an environmental social scientist. So it wasn't just wolves, but it was also beavers. It was climate. It was disease. Those cycles of what we call dynamic equilibrium that are always at work in the natural world. And part of my concern in terms of, again, cutting and pasting that to our pair of islands in the North Atlantic is that it has really animated the discussion. Now, I've never heard the term lynx change rivers yet, but in my opinion, some of the messaging is almost cut and pasted that wolves saved, redeemed. It's almost quasi-religious language. Wolves saved Yellowstone, therefore lynx will save Scotland. And it's just, nature doesn't work like that. There are so many factors at work, and it's a bit disingenuous to claim otherwise. The evidence would back it up because when we look at lynx and wolves recolonizing parts of Western Europe in landscapes like that, like we've said already, are a bit like your Dorset landscape behind you or those landscapes of the Netherlands and Switzerland. We often don't see quite the same ecological effects, the trophic cascades and the landscapes of fear unfolding in those places because we're present. There are roads and farms and power lines and houses and towns and homesteads. And our presence in those landscapes means that the ecology often works a bit differently.
Now, we touched on this a couple of times already, but I wonder if we can think about it in a bit more detail. Wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone after an absence of just a few decades, not even 100 years, I don't think. Whereas in the UK, we're talking about an absence in terms of lynx of at least hundreds, possibly, more than 1,000 years ago, and wolves, is again hundreds of years back. And similarly extinct is any instinctive or community knowledge for how to live with them, that kind of epigenetic element, the learned element in there that ought to be innately in all of us, will have disappeared as well. How do you think society would respond and cope with large carnivores? I mean, this obviously wouldn't happen if, the North Yorkshire National Park was fenced in the way that we were discussing just a moment ago. But if that wasn't the case, how do you think people would cope with large carnivores being there on the edges or even, within villages, towns, and cities?
Yeah, what you're describing there is what's sometimes called the extinction of experience. That, as you've said, it's not just that the species become extinct, it's that our relationship with those species becomes extinct. And having what I would call when it comes to predators, just common sense is often what is required in being with around riskier animals, just like with you and your son going into a risky landscape, climbing a mountain, common sense preparation. Um, in my experience, hopefully I won't sound too cynical, the problem with common sense is it's just not that common, Finlo. And whereas I think there would be lots of people who would seek out those landscapes, even if they would very rarely see a lynx and very rarely see a wolf, they would seek it out and they would go in a way where they were prepared and they knew don't let your dog off the lead. If encounter an animal, stand your ground. Don't approach it. Back off slowly. Don't turn your back. Don't run. All of those sort of things that we use when we were in landscapes with large carnivores across the world. I'm confident that the majority of people would have the common sense to do that. But I think there are, like the people you encountered climbing those mountains who went up in high heels, a significant majority absent of common sense in relating to large carnivores that could lead to some difficult issues and challenges that would then take on a whole life of their own in the media, social media, and political realm. And it's that hyping of one or two risky incidents that I think could lead to a lot of shaping of the debate in unfortunate ways.
What I'm really wondering about is it's when the lynx turns up on the housing estate, when there's a wolf looking through the fence at a playground, what happens at that point?
Yeah, two good examples from that. One is from the Netherlands, where within the last year or so, the most wolves in the Netherlands are in the central forested region called the Veluwe. And there was a report which has subsequently been contested that a wolf approached a kindergarten group in for this forested area and it may have nipped a small child. And then there was a huge debate about whether the wolf should be shot or whether it shouldn't be shot. In my view, it should be, because any credible threat to human life means that that animal poses a risk and it needs to be removed. But also it's for the good of the species, because if a wolf ever seriously injured someone, it would be really bad for wolves in general. So again, there's this tension between the good of the species as opposed to the good of the individual. So we need to be able to prepare to act and have the debates about difficult and emotive topics like the use of force, lethal control, hazing, and removing problem animals. We're not going to be able to avoid those topics in these islands, and we're going to bring them back and have to engage with them. The other point about you're saying, or useful example about when the lynx turns up on the edge of a housing estate, or the wolves looking in the school window or whatever, you really need to have trained professionals on call to come and deal with that. And the state of Wyoming has a really great large carnivore team who are on call to respond to incidents with large carnivores, whether it involves people or whether it involves predators, 24/7, 365. And they're not only trained to use force ethically and effectively, but they're also simultaneously scientists. So it's informed by data. It's informed by the fact that every wolf pack in the state has a radio collar, a GPS collar. So they're collecting data all the time. They know where the troublemakers are oftentimes. And we're going to need to think about who's going to do that in Britain and Ireland. And crucially, are they somewhere in between? Are they involved in reintroductions or farming, or are they in between so that they're trusted by both parties? Again, we've talked about the extinction of experience. We don't have that apparatus yet for dealing with these animals. So we would have to devise that. There's probably some parallels with sea eagles, I would think, but we're going to need to design that from the ground up too. And that sort of thing costs money, costs serious amounts of money to fund that infrastructure. And to date, I've been quite surprised about the lack of long-term financial forecasting and planning uh, about those sorts of things, as well as making sure that the funds for compensation schemes are going to be there over the next century. I think we really need to see more of that.
And one of the points that Cora, the sheep farmer, made in our podcast about Scotland and the Lynx was thinking about the cost of the things that you've just talked about, and for her, it wasn't just about having the potential threat against her livestock, against her flock, but it was also a question of priorities in terms of public spending at a time when there really isn't an awful lot of money around. What would be the cost of arranging, of organizing the infrastructure, and she wasn't convinced that there was enough preparation being done, enough forward thought to make sure that infrastructure that you're talking about, which all sounds innately sensible, to make sure that that's in place before animals are reintroduced and before there are problems.
I would broadly agree with that. It's one of my concerns about the proposals to date. The short answer to how much is it going to cost? No one has a clue, an absolute ballyhoo clue about how much it's going to cost, because the data just isn't out there. The only thing I was able to do in my book is take the example of Switzerland, with the caveat that it's most of that funding goes on wolves as opposed to lynx, but many of the approaches to guarding livestock are very similar for all of these species. And most of the compensation costs, about 3.3 million spent per year in Switzerland in 2021, 2020, 2021. We're not spending compensation because you're compensating for livestock, which isn't massively expensive, even if you were paying at twice the market rate. It's when you start to pay for the technical support and the research and the team to be on call 24/7, 365, you're getting into paying for human labor and expertise. And you're paying for pensions, you're paying
Mm.
overheads to institutions. Like all of this costs serious amounts of money. And you're also then thinking about which organization is going to host that capacity. Is it going to be Nature Scot? Is it going to be Natural England? Is it going to be a rewilding organization who are seen as inherently pro reintroduction, or a farming organization who are maybe seen as inherently anti? Is there a safe pair of hands who can manage that somewhere in between? All of these things we're really going to have to think about. And I think if we want to give farmers long-term confidence, not just for them and their business, but for their children and their grandchildren living on the land, even if the land and the landscape and farming looks very different in 70 years than it does now, we really need to have those concrete plans in place and be able to make sure that we stump up the money to make it all work.
You talked about the way that land looks. And while there is obviously a certain romantic aspect to the idea of having wolves and lynx back in Britain again, these animals died out because their habitat became depleted and because they were persecuted by people. Do you think any of these things, either of these things, have changed for the better in the intervening years?
I think since we last had these animals here, the population of both Britain and Ireland has increased massively. The livestock population has also increased massively, and I would imagine that the forest cover has also decreased. Nevertheless, these animals, especially wolves, are adaptable, and the studies that have been done to date have shown that we have the carrying capacity for lynx across much of Scotland, northern England, parts of, say, south East England, Thetford Forest area. With wolves, there's only really a study from Scotland which would suggest that there's about, I think, over 20,000 square kilometers of suitable habitat with deer densities to match. So again, there's this conception of where is wild enough. The data would suggest that there are parts that are technically feasible in terms of space. They also have, crucially, the prey available in terms of larger deer species for wolves and smaller, including some invasive deer species like a muntjac or Chinese water deer for lynx. The data would suggest that we do have, and in many cases, that's a problem. They spread Lyme's disease, they cause road traffic collisions. If you're an arable farmer, they eat your crops. They're a source of TB as well. So there's nuance and complexity here. ffinlo as well. There may be benefits, hidden benefits for farmers, as well as the more obvious costs. But I think it ultimately, this is going to come down to what sort of vision do we have for the future of the land?
Mm.
And that I'm under no illusions that there are an increasing number of people in this world, and an increasing number of people living in these islands, and maybe someday lynx and wolves coming back. But the amount of land is fixed, which means there is increasing demand and pressure to try and satisfy all these demands and all these visions of rewilding, climate, nature, food security, rural livelihoods, to try to satisfy it from the same piece of land. And one of the ways that I think that will be sorted in the coming decades is we will see increasing zoning of landscapes and land use strategies where we accept that the fertile lowlands, through sustainable intensification, probably produce the bulk of our food. And we will probably see extensification then in upland areas, which is exactly the landscapes which are most likely to have large carnivores back.
Yeah, and that sort of conversation about land sparing versus land sharing, I guess, as it is, that's a bigger conversation for another time.
Of
But
course.
yeah, and I mean, again, I thought, going through your book, that it was very, very balanced, and you said you hope that there can be something for everybody within there, and I think there is, because you really are coming at this with a combination of excitement and enthusiasm, at the same time looking at the nuance and being very realistic about some of the challenges. And I think it's really important to kind of have those middle way conversations, which we try to
Mhm.
champion within Farmgate as well,
Yeah.
as part of that. But it did strike me, just finally, from reading your book, that to live with large carnivores requires a great deal of effort on behalf of farmers. And when the agricultural policy landscape and farm resilience are currently so challenging and not likely to get any easier in the short to medium term, at least, why should farmers have to take on even more of a burden to stay in business?
it's one of the reasons why and for those farmers interested in reading my Nuffield farming report, you'll see I create what I call a reintroduction coexistence framework. So in part of it, I talk about this coexistence toolkit, practical tools that we can use to share landscapes with large carnivores in farming, some of which we've talked about today, the deterrence, the finance, the force, the enterprise, things like tourism, governance. But I take a step back then and I talk about the context, which you've just alluded to, about this debate about large carnivore reintroductions does not take place in a vacuum. It takes place in this context where there's so many other things going on in rural areas, so many other things going on in the political realm. And like I said in the previous question, a lot of it comes down to this increasing pressure on land to do so many things and on farmers to do so many things. And I really felt that when I was running a small farm, we needed really high animal welfare, nature conservation, pay good wages for our staff, including myself. And we also did care and social farming. So we were running services, community work. And it may have been too much to try and balance simultaneously. And I do feel that farmers are under a lot of pressure. And I feel in the conversations that I'm had, they often say this is just another thing. So it's not taken in isolation. I think the antidote to that is twofold. One is that there are these big strategic shifts happening, particularly to upland areas and marginal ground, where there is going to be increasing competition from energy and from carbon sequestration, especially from forestry, that is, may outcompete farming, and particularly through afforestation, create more habitat and more prey as deer fill those newly forested areas for having these animals back. I think that's one of the things that's going to happen. But the other thing I would say to make it easier is those who want to have these species back, in my view, really need to make farmers an offer that they can't refuse. They need to make a proposition that makes farmers' lives easier instead of harder. It needs to make their businesses more profitable instead of less profitable. It needs to turn these animals from liabilities into assets. And I would really like to see the debate focus more on making that happen.
I think that's a great place to leave the conversation, Jonny. That's been really fascinating, and you know, I've loved listening to the way that you've talked through the issues associated with that. But that's all we have time for. Jonny mentioned his Nuffield Scholarship thesis, I suppose, his report. If you Google Jonny Hanson and Nuffield, then it comes up very quickly. And I will stick in the show notes a link to that report and also to where you can get a copy of Jonny's book, Living with Lynx. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, please do take a moment to check out Farmgate Leaders and our Filling the Funding Gap series. For now, I'd like to thank my guest, Jonny Hanson, author of Living with Lynx, published by Pelagic. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been ffinlo Costain. Bye for now.